Okay, so this is our second lecture on ancient Greece, and now what we're going to do is move into the classical period, which sometimes is dated to around 600 BC to about 400, 350 BC. It's pretty interesting when you look at how people look at history. So we've mentioned something called the Eden complex, which is where in the quote olden days, everything was in a perfect condition, and as time goes on, things get worse. There's also something called the ascendancy theory, and this is what many people today actually follow, is that there's a progression in human history that things get better. So as I put up here, there's progress in society, technology, art, and morals. I'm pulling this from a book by Tommen, page 31. It's interesting because for sustainability studies, we are seeing sort of a mix of this. Like it was good in the olden days when we weren't sort of wrecking the planet, and then it's also part of this ascendancy theory that we hope that society, technology, human behavior will actually pull us out of the mess that we find ourselves in today. Okay, getting back to Greek history, I do want to talk about this time period. So if you remember in the last lecture, we talked about the Mycenaean period and the collapse of that civilization around 1200 BC. So as you know, they had cities during this period. And then came the Dark Ages, which might have been brought on by climate change, where the Greeks forgot how to write and cities collapsed, the economy collapsed, society essentially collapsed. And then after the Dark Ages, you see cities once again. Now, I really didn't have to point this out on the slide, but we know that these people were totally dependent on agriculture, like everyone else in the ancient world. That was what fueled everything. We do get a few Greek philosophers talking about nature. Now, one was Heraclitus of Ephesus, and I've given you his dates here, where he says, wisdom consists of speaking the truth, listening to nature, and acting in accordance with her. Now, that sounds like some really good advice that even we can follow today. However, when you read about what these philosophers have to say, one thing you have to worry about is, did the common person in ancient Greece, in the 400s BC, or even, a little bit earlier, if you're talking about the time of Heraclitus, did they even know about him? Did they know about his writings and so on? So you have to really be careful with what these philosophers are saying, because they may only be thinking this in their head and have a very small audience, while the rest of ancient Greece is going about its day-to-day thing. So just be aware that we can pull various statements out from what the Greeks are talking about, but you have to be careful with that. And that's why we like to rely more on science for this. Speaking of science, so when you talk about what's happening in ancient Greece, and we looked at this with the pollen counts and the charcoal counts in 1200 BC with the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, where they cut down trees, it caused soil erosion, just erosion of soil in general. We can look at how ancient cities were once on the Aegean Sea, are now inland. So a couple of examples are Troy, and let me see if I can get my pen. So Troy is here, Ephesus is here, and then Miletus isn't on this map, but it's also on the west coast of the Aegean. These were right on the sea, and now they're inland. So what's probably happening here, and we know this from the science, is that erosion was getting worse during this first millennium BC, when huge population rises were happening after the Dark Age. And so part of what's happening is that they're cutting down their trees, massive amounts of soil is eroding down into the plains, and then it's filling up what used to be rivers into silt and now land. Now, some of this is natural. We know that shorelines change over time. Almost some of this is certainly related to human behavior and cutting down trees and just causing a mess. We can look at a variety of places for erosion impacts in the science. So you can look at lake sediments. So where you take a core sample from a lake, and then you do pollen and charcoal studies and so on. There's more evidence of coastal erosion, where there's a town called, or a city called Thessaloniki, where you can see erosion deposits from 4200 to about 2750 before present. So remember to subtract almost 2000 from these numbers. So here it'd be about 750 BC. Then you get what's called the geometric period in Greek history. And we're not going to go into all this, but it's named after pottery, and it's generally dated 900 to 700 BC when you see cities start to be rebuilt. And then when you get to the classical period, and you can look at the article by Walsh on page 869, it talks about this, we see evidence of deforestation, and of course, one of the impacts or one of the effects of deforestation is erosion. And think of Plato's comment. So at the very beginning, and I'll show Plato's comment here in just a bit. At the beginning of class, I showed a couple of comments where Plato is clearly thinking about soil erosion and the damage that people have done in and around Athens. Okay, so now let's look at the science. So here's some erosion data, which we haven't looked at, and pollen data, which of course we have. And sorry, that's supposed to be P there for pollen. So we've looked at, arboreal pollen sum, arboreal pollen index, so that's the tree pollen, and then we looked at these specific pollens. So we are talking about the classical period, so this is before present, so we're really focusing on about 500 BC or so. And as you take your line across, I'm not going to do this very well, but let me see if I can get all the way across and keep it fairly straight. Okay, so this is the area that we want to concentrate on. So, for example, the arboreal pollen, you can see it increases, there's a little dip, and then a pretty big increase. Now, part of this is getting into the Roman period, but that's okay for this particular example. What we're looking at, want to focus on here, is the increase in erosion intensity. Now, we can look a little bit back now. Right now, we're focusing on the classical period, but the middle of this is about when you start to see intensive agriculture starting in northern Greece. And so really what I want us to concentrate on this, and then this is another section of ancient Greece where you can see quite a bit of erosion. So people are definitely damaging the soils, and then you get erosion, which causes lots of other problems that we've talked about. Now, this is the exact same thing. So this is the previous slide was about northern Greece. This is about southern Greece. Again, you want to focus on this line about 500. You can see the increase here, and then you can see the erosion data here. Okay, and then these are total pollen counts for northern and southern Greece. And, we really want to focus on these particular lines where red is northern Greece, blue is southern Greece, where we've looked at arboreal pollen sum. We've looked at these other tree species and so on, where you can see in some places there's a pretty big increase in the pollen counts, and then you might get a decrease. It depends on what people are growing. This is what these charts are really showing us. Okay, so let's move on to trees. So, this is what causes erosion when people cut these down. And we've talked a little bit about this before. You can pull out some information from various sources about the average use of wood for a household. So there's an article in a book called Human Landscapes in Classical Antiquity, The Uses of Uncultivated Landscape on page 85. The author suggests that about 6 tons of wood are needed for each house. And then if you calculate 50 households, actually that number is wrong. It's not 250 tons. It should be 300 tons. I'll have to check that source again. It looks like they're either mistaken my math or they're a mistake. But anyway, that's a lot of wood being used for a village of 50 households. When you look at pollen studies, they show a decline, no big surprise, of oak and pine forests. So people are cutting these particular trees down, especially in northern Greece. And then, no big surprise, I could have asked you this. Charcoal studies show an increase of charcoal, meaning people are burning a lot more lumber, which causes charcoal deposits to increase, or charcoal particles in this case of these studies, to increase, showing that people are cutting down trees and burning them. Now let's look at Athens just for a little bit. So this is probably the most famous city in ancient Greece. It probably became a large, important city during the Dark Ages, where it seems to survive this downfall, and then probably became very important after that. We know that in ancient Greece, the population tripled between 1000 BC and 400 BC. And think about, agriculture, growing food for that amount of people that quickly, and then cutting down trees. What's also interesting too is that you don't see a total switch from meat to cereals, but people are growing more cereals than they are eating meat. And meat becomes very expensive, and usually just for the wealthy people. And the one interesting thing about Athens is that it had agricultural land surrounding it, so they could grow some of their food, but they couldn't grow all the food for the city-state. So what happened is that they're dependent on grain imports in particular, and wood imports. So that's kind of a dangerous situation to be in unless you're a major city, which they were, but we'll talk about a war that they got involved in where their trade was cut off. And then we've got Plato living in this classical period. And, I've noted this before. Greeks don't walk around, ancient Greeks, and say, oh, this is what sustainability is. We have to look at all the evidence. So you look at what people wrote, which wasn't that much, and you look at the science. Plato is really interesting because he was concerned with population growth and what that meant for a city-state. So he knew that as a population grows, it needs more and more resources. There's only so many resources out there unless you go to war and take over your neighbor. He didn't want that. So in his work called The Republic, which is really about a fictional place that he thinks is fairly perfect, he notes that people will go to war over resources. And so his solution to that was to have population control. So people having so many children and then practicing abortion, and so on. And if we look at his other work called The Laws, he also writes something very similar. He also knew that when people needed more resources and didn't have them, it led to starvation, which then led to war. And then this was his famous quote that he gives, and I'll just give you a second to read that. You might want to pause the video because I'm going to move ahead here. Okay, we know a little bit about the Athenian farm that Plato was sort of hinting at. Studies have shown that you have some good years where you can get a pretty good yield in terms of agriculture. However, there were a lot of poor soils in the area, and they would overfarm. And it's thought that you would get crop failures, or maybe not totally crop failures, but not enough to grow to feed the population, 7 years out of 18. And so that's very serious. And then what we know is that people would supplement what they're eating, what they're growing, with hunting, foraging, and then buying things on the market. That's assuming that they would have money to do this. Now, I had mentioned a little bit earlier that Greece goes into sort of a civil war with what's called the Peloponnesian War. This is a war between Sparta and Athens. We know that before the war, Athens founded a city called Amphipolis, and this is in the far north of Greece, which gave them access to all these natural resources like timber in particular from the north. And so they did that on purpose because it was a strategic thing for them, because they needed grain and they needed lumber. So they set up a city, put colonists up there, and then made it their own so that they could take these materials. Now, this isn't a Greek history class, but I will tell you at the end of the Peloponnesian War, Athens lost. Their navy was destroyed, which they used for trade, and therefore it also lost its grain supply that it had to pull in from a lot of other city-states. So this war was not necessarily over resources, but that's what it came down to. The lack of resources caused a lot of issues in Athens and the rest of Greece during this period when the economy sort of fell apart because of the war. So again, we're really referring to sort of some social justice issues, especially for the poor who are stuck in with not only fighting and then having to deal with the aftermath of the war. We also know a little bit about what Aristotle had to say, and he was also interested in the same issues that we talked about from Plato, so overpopulation, which would lead to social unrest. He was an advocate, if you look at his book called Politics, for abortion, which was, induced miscarriages. And now, knowing that, rethink the link, that's no, incorrect. So rethink about the link between sustainability and social justice issues, where Aristotle is saying, women need to get abortions to control the population. There's also a really good article by Feen, which states, on page 457, the only answer to survival was any of the war, export, and commerce, and so on, for population control. And then this is a quote on what Aristotle has to say in one of his books, which is actually a really interesting book if you get a chance to look at it. It's talking about how land has changed over time. And some of this is natural, like climate change. But, in the time of the Trojans, the land was marshy, could only support a small population, whereas Mycenae was in good condition. The land of Mycenae has become dry. Now, we know that, in 1200 BC, the whole thing collapsed. Now it's dry and barren, and so on. So it's a really interesting commentary on some of the history of this particular place where climate change and human action really affects the landscape. What's also interesting here, I just wanted to put this quote here. This is written by a Roman, but we know that Greek writers wrote about agriculture, they wrote about farming, and so on. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of these, but Varro tells us that there are separate treatises that talk about agriculture, which are more than 50 in number. Now, it's unfortunate that we don't have these, but clearly Greeks were writing about these particular issues. And then finally, for the last slide I have here, which is a little bit later, we'll talk about Romans in a few weeks. But during the Roman occupation, we know that they used a lot of forests. They cut down a lot of woods in northern Greece, and they, destroyed the populations of fir and pine. And then we know that beech grew up from pollen studies. And I mentioned this before in a previous lecture, that beech is one of those trees that grows in an area where, if oak has been cut down, oaks don't have a chance to grow very fast. Beech grow fairly quickly, and they will repopulate an area unless people are cutting more and more down. So we've been talking, and you've been reading about ancient Greece since the very beginning of class. So I won't say too much more. In the next lecture, we will start looking at what the Romans were doing.